before we get going, just a quick announcement. You should have seen this in the FLBC news, and it's on the back of the connection guide, but I just want to say it publicly. This coming Sunday, and then the following Sunday, this coming Sunday, August 20th, we'll have a family meeting, followed by, on the 27th, a member meeting, just to start a conversation about how best to steward our financial and physical resources, particularly when it comes to the Holt campus. So we want to ask the Lord's vision and direction, and just want to have an informational kind of conversation about how that might work. So please make those notes on your calendar, and we're going to send out a letter later this week with some more information about what that might look like. I've got a thing in my throat, my mouth here, so it's my annual sinus infection. Just bear with me. It's going to sound weird, but we're all good. So really, from as far back as I can remember, our middle daughter, Nora Lynn, has had what, after some Googling, we just found out was little bumps on her legs caused by a skin infection called molluscum contagiosum, which sounds exactly like something from Harry Potter. So it's basically these like little red bumps that pop up on her legs, and all of our kids have had them, and sometimes they go away on their own. But we noticed recently that hers weren't going away. In fact, they were getting worse and more irritated and spreading faster. So we thought, hey, we can't just rub some dirt on it. So we called the dermatologist and got an appointment. And by a miracle of the Almighty on high, we got her in before the year 2040. If you've tried to get a dermatologist appointment recently, you know exactly how insane that is. So they actually got us in fairly quickly. We show up, and the dermatologist said, listen, it's molluscum, and we got two options. Okay, we can take the first option, where we pin down your 3-year-old, and I take a knife, and we just scrape them off her skin. And he said, yeah, that's going to be the traumatic option. And anytime a doctor tells you that what they're about to do is traumatic, you know it's going to be pretty nasty. So the other option was go grab some Compound W and rub it on there for once every couple of weeks for a few weeks and see what happens. So that's the route we went with, the less traumatic, less horrific treatment plan. So grab some Compound W on the way home. Got her home, got her bathed, and said, hey, okay, baby, we got to put your cream on. Now, I don't know what this is going to do to her. She doesn't know. She doesn't care. She just knows the bumps itch. I want some help. So she innocently lays on her stomach, and we kind of just pat her back, and I just pop open the thing, and the doctor said, just kind of douse it all over, and so that's all he said. So that's what we did. I just got to open it up and start sprinkling some on there, and in the first few seconds, man, this thing is going super smooth. Nobody's losing their mind. Everybody's calm. We're laughing, giggling. There's no pain. And so I thought, man, if this is how smooth this is going to go, then we should have done this months ago. And no sooner did that thought flash into my head, did she, out of nowhere, let out this guttural, blood-curdling scream. Like the kind of scream that if you hear it as a parent or grandparent, makes all the blood leave your body. Like one of those life or death kind of screams. It burns! It burns! It burns! Take it off! Take it off! It burns! And so we're panicked. Like this was not in the treatment plan. So we're grabbing like gauzes and water and bandages, and we're trying to wipe it off. And in a moment of like pure panic, I was so desperate, I even ran and grabbed a bag of her favorite chocolate candy and just started dumping it in front of her, hoping that it would calm her down. So finally, it stops burning. We get her calmed down, get her to bed, and that was 2 weeks ago. And today, if you look at the back of her legs, you'll still see some of the same Band-Aids we used. You'll still see the bumps. You'll still see the bruises. You'll still see the sores, because she won't let us touch them. She won't let us get near them. If we even mention solution or legs or Band-Aids, she's, and she like runs to her room and hide in her bed, which is her 3-year-old way of communicating. I don't think I can trust you. It's her 3-year-old way of saying, how can I trust you now when I trusted you before and you hurt me? Like, how can I put hope that you're going to heal me now when I put my hope that you were going to heal me before and you didn't? In fact, I trusted you to help me, and you just caused pain and suffering. And that's a question I think, if we're honest, and if we live long enough, all of us ask about the Lord. How can I trust a God who lets me experience the kind of pain and suffering that's represented all across this room? How can I put my hope in the promises of a God who lets me walk through the kind of pain that I've walked through? How in the world can I trust this God that's supposed to be for me and yet lets me go through seasons where it seems like, by all accounts, he's against me? And one of the things I love about the Bible is it just doesn't sugarcoat the human experience. I mean, it's just right up front honest that all of us are either coming out of, in the middle of, or heading for a difficult season of pain and suffering and loss. And so, how in the world, if that's true, can we trust a God like that? How do we find hope in our hurt? And that's the question that the book of Ruth, at least chapter 1, is going to help us answer. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and grab them. Ruth chapter 1. We're going to kick off a 4-week series in the book of Ruth. If you don't own a Bible, please take the one that's on the back of the seat in front of you. That's our gift. We'd love for you to have it. Take it home, use it, write in it, make it yours. If you don't know where Ruth is and you don't have a phone or a tablet, it's in the front half or so of your book. So if you hit Psalms, you're gone too far, just kind of split it in the middle. Take the first fourth of your Bible, and it's somewhere in there. Feel free to use a table of contents. It's a tiny little book, 4 chapters. We're going to take 4 weeks, and we could just kind of do all 4 chapters at once. We're just going to walk chapter by chapter, actually, and feel the story as it unfolds, as they would have heard it back 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So Ruth chapter 1, we're going to approach this a little differently. We're going to read a little bit of a little chunk, and then we'll stop. Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1, here's what the scriptures say. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. A man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. The man's name was Elimelech, which means my God is king, which is super ironic, and you'll find out why in a second. And his wife's name was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They were wealthy, part of God's covenant people. They entered the fields of Moab and settled there. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her 2 sons took Moabite women as their wives. One's name was Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So there's so much that we could talk about here in this first 5 verses. I just want to highlight 3 components of this story, and I'll tell you why that's important later. Here's the first one I want to show you. This is a story about tragic brokenness. This is a story of tragic brokenness, and let me show you why I'm saying that. In the first 10 seconds, like the first scene of the movie, we learn this in verse 1. This happens during the time of the judges. Now, what that means is, if you look, actually just look back to the left, 1 page, at the end of Judges chapter 21, the very last verse, verse 25. Here's what it says. Here's a 1-sentence summary of what happened in the time of the judges. Verse 25, chapter 21, last verse in the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him. So this story is set in a scene of total moral chaos. So everybody's doing what they think is right. There's no submission to authority, no respect for the Lord, no pursuit of the things of God. It's just a free-for-all. Think Las Vegas meets Panama City during spring break week, and they're calling themselves the people of God. Think about that kind of raunchy chaos, and that's what's happening in the lives of the people of God. They're in this vicious, toxic cycle of disobedience, slavery, repentance, deliverance, and yet they disobey again, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. It's pure chaos. But it's also a story not just of moral chaos, but it's also a story of physical desperation. Look what he says in verse 1. During the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. Now, most of us, have never been in a famine. We don't have any idea what it's like to go to bed hungry and wake up hungry, and there's no DoorDash, there's no Walmart pickup. There's literally nothing to eat but dirt and sand. So what's so crazy about this little detail is Elimelech and his family, they're living in Bethlehem. Do you know what Bethlehem literally means? It means house of bread. There's no bread in the house of bread because God is withholding food from his people as a consequence of their sin. So this is not I'm starving because I'm really hungry. So our kids say that. So we yesterday we went to this little cheer thing for my daughter, a little scrimmage, and it was 8,000 degrees outside. And so what happens when kids get hot and they don't have anything fun to do is they just get hungry. So our 3-year-old as soon as we showed up, it was hot, sweaty, I'm irritable, I'm frustrated, whatever. And she said, I'm hungry. I'm starving, Daddy. And it's like, no, you're not. You just had an applesauce on the way in here. I'm starving. What she meant by that is, I'm really hungry. And so we got her a snack. That's not a famine. This is a humanitarian crisis where the people of God have nothing to eat. Men, women, and children are dying. And so Elimelech and a lot of people like him grab what they can, as emaciated and dehydrated and just malnourished as they are, and they take the risky trip that could have cost them their lives and travel to places where there are food. And they end up traveling to Moab. Now, I don't know what you know about Moab, but it actually gets us into this third part of the story. It's a story about chaos, and it's a story about famine. It's a story about failure and disobedience. See, Elimelech takes his family to Moab. Now, I don't know what you know about Moab, but it is a pagan, depraved, sexually perverse city. In fact, in Deuteronomy 23, God explicitly tells his people, do not go to Moab, don't associate with the Moabites, have nothing to do with them. And he even says, Bethlehem, Israelite men, don't marry Moabite women. Okay, well, who do Naomi's sons marry? Orpah and Ruth. Where are they from? Well, they're from Moab. So you might be thinking, okay, but Elimelech's family is starving. He's surrounded by death and famine. He's just trying to provide for his family. What's so wrong with that? Okay, but the problem is not that he's trying to provide for his family. The problem is how he tries to provide for his family. He provides for his family by deliberately disobeying the command that God had explicitly given him. By saying to them, hey, I know we're in Bethlehem, the place where the presence and power of God is, but he's not doing what I think he should do and what I think he said he'd do, so we don't trust him. We're going to pick up and move to Moab, of all places, which is the one place or one of the places God told them not to move. It's just straight up disobedience. So we got chaos, famine, disobedience, and then somehow the story gets more tragic. Look what happens. Verse 3. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. They had Mahlon and Chilion. Verse 3. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died. Don't you love how that, it's just simple, matter of fact, no emotion. He just died. And she was left with her 2 sons. What happened to them? Verse 5. Both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And the woman, not even Naomi, just the woman, was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So in the span of just a few years, she goes from having a wealthy husband and 2 sons, which is exactly what you want as an Israelite woman. She's got protection, care, provision. And after she plans 3 funerals, one for her husband, and some of you know what it's like to bury a spouse, and 2 kids. Some of you know what that's like. She wakes up one morning and finds herself homeless, helpless, a beggar with no social status, no one to care for her, no one to provide for her. This is a story of death. This is a story of a kind of brokenness that if we'll just allow ourselves, insert ourselves into the story, makes you can just feel the heaviness. So we started with chaos, and then we got some famine, and then we got straight up disobedience, and then we got the worst of all, maybe death. This is a tragically broken story. And Naomi finds herself a broken, hurting woman. And she thinks, I have no husband, I have no kids, I'm going to be helpless with no one to care for me, provide for me, protect me. Or so she thinks. Look what happens next in verse 6. Naomi and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. Verse 7, she left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. So she's going to go back home. And here's what she says in verse 8. Naomi said to them, each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you as you've shown to the dead, to their husbands, and to me. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She kissed them, and they wept loudly. I mean, they've been through some stuff. Verse 9, verse 10. They said to her, we insist on returning with you to your people. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? No, return home. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up and to grow old and to marry them? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying for another 20 years? No, my daughters. This line, I think, if we're honest, we've all uttered. In a moment of hurt and pain, it says in verse 13, no, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. You want to talk about hurt? When you feel like the God who's promised to protect you has turned against you? Verse 14, again, they wept loudly. This is not a pretty room. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. But Ruth clung to her. That's the same word we see in Genesis 2 to describe marriage. Leaving and cleaving, Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, look, Ruth, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I'll go. And wherever you live, I'll live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried, and may the Lord punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you and me. Well, that's not what we expected. And yet, what Ruth says here in 2 verses is one of the most powerful, clear examples of loyalty, of faithfulness, of covenant, of friendship. And what she shows us is that, yes, this is a story about tragic brokenness. But it's in the middle of that tragic brokenness that we see a second thing about this story, which is it's a story of selfless sacrifice. Did you see that? Ruth who has everything ahead of her in Moab, with where she's from, her family, her friends, her loved ones, her future. It's all there. And she says, in an act of radical, risk-taking love, it's almost like she grabs Naomi's face as she's having a meltdown. She says, Naomi, stop it. Just stop it. Listen to me. Listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. If I have to give up my future, I'll do it. If I have to move from Moab to Bethlehem where they hate me and will mock me and maybe even kill me, I'll do it. If I have to give up a husband and sons and security and prosperity, I'll do it. She even says in verse 17, if I have to give up my very life to protect you and care for you and help you be rescued from your brokenness, I'll do it. Now that is selfless sacrifice, if there ever were an example of selfless sacrifice. Ruth says, I'm going to lay down as much of my life as it requires, if it means your healing. Keep that in mind, that's important. So it's a story of tragic brokenness, and it's a story of selfless sacrifice, but it's also a story of one more thing. Let me show you, verse 19. Naomi is so stunned by what Ruth just said. She can't even, all she can do is cling to Ruth and just weep. And here's what verse 18 says. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. So she wasn't mad. She just was so stunned and left speechless and saw there's no way I'm stopping this, so she just stopped. And then once they get some rest and pack their things up, verse 19, the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. And when they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival. And the local women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? She's been gone for 10 years. Is this her? Is it possible? She came back? I thought she would have died over there or become a pagan or whatever. Is this her? Verse 20, don't call me Naomi. Just stop calling me that. Call me Mara, she answered. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I love the honesty. There's no pretending here. I'm hurting, I'm bitter, I'm frustrated, I'm angry. I went away full with a husband and sons, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Which is ironic because Ruth is standing right there. Empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has opposed me, and the Almighty has afflicted me. So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived, important line, they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now you might think that's a weird detail, but here's why that detail is so important. Because it shows us that not only is this a story of tragic brokenness and selfless sacrifice, it's a story of sure hope. Of sure hope. So here's a little interesting fact about the book of Ruth. It's the first time in the Bible we actually see the word hope. We saw it in verse 12 explicitly, but the way we use the word hope in English is not the way that the Bible talks about hope. So when we use the word hope, we almost always mean something that we want to happen or wish would happen, but we're not sure it will. So we'll say things like, I hope I get that job, or I hope the AC doesn't break, or I hope my tire's not flat, or I hope I turn off the coffee pot, or I hope Alabama's defense is better, or I hope. And what we mean is, no, I think it'll happen. I want it to happen. I'm not sure it'll happen. I don't have that assurance. And the Bible doesn't use hope that way at all. No, biblical hope is, it is 1,000% sure happening. It just hasn't happened yet. So it's as good as happened. We're just waiting with expectation to watch it unfold. And while we wait, we're going to be shaped and molded, and our lives are going to be changed as we wait with eager expectation of this sure, confident hope. See, here's what's so interesting about this story. Remember, when Elimelech and Naomi left Bethlehem, there was no food. That's why they left. Wasn't a drop of barley anywhere. And at some point between verse 1 and verse 19, Naomi convinces herself in her pain and frustration and bitterness that God has forgotten her, that God is against her, that God is opposing her. And if you just use your imagination, as Naomi and Ruth walk back into Bethlehem, nervous, anxious, what are they going to say? What are they going to think? I got a Moabitess here. How's that going to go? And Naomi comes back. She sees that grocery store she used to shop at, that coffee shop she went to, that neighbor that she loved to talk to at the mailbox. And she starts seeing some familiar stuff, and she sees some fields that she ran in as a little girl. I wonder if as she walked through the fields that 10 years ago when she left them were as barren as she could never, they're bone dry. Wasn't an ounce of anything anywhere. And now all of a sudden, there's barley popping up everywhere. I wonder if in that moment, she was reminded of some passages she would have learned as a little girl. Like Psalm 38. I wonder if as the barley smacked up against her legs, and she started got a glimpse that maybe her story isn't over. She remembered Psalm 38, which says, we put our hope in the Lord. He is our help and our shield. And in him our hearts rejoice. Not in family or fortune or security or future, in him. For we trust in his holy name. Let your unfailing love surround us, Lord, for our hope is in you alone. I just wonder if that's what she thought. Or she remembered hope-filled passages like Psalm 62, rest in God alone, my soul, for my hope comes from him. Or Lamentations 3, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will hope in him forever. See, for the first time in 10 years, she felt a glimpse of something she had thought would never, ever happen again. Just a glimmer of hope. And here's what's so cool about this story. That hope that sparks in her as she re-enters Bethlehem and sees there's some bread, there's some food that God has not forgotten, that he has not abandoned, that he has not forsaken. That little spark of hope explodes on the canvas of creation 1,000 years later when a little baby boy descended from Ruth is born in some of the same barley troughs in Bethlehem. And he called himself the bread of life. And maybe you've heard of him, his name is Jesus. You see, the reason this story is so incredible is that it's not just a story that happened 3,000 years ago. This story of tragic brokenness and selfless sacrifice and sure hope, that's your story. And that's my story. That's the story that God has been writing since Genesis 1, this story of redemption, of a world of tragic brokenness. Hello, anybody? I mean, one of the things that they just don't prepare you for in seminary is the kind of rooms you're going to walk in. Where kids are on life support. And a surgery that was supposed to go smoothly just went off the rails. Or when the sweet saint who's been married to the spouse for 50, 60 years holds their hand as they take their last breath. Those are awful rooms. That's tragic brokenness. And it all comes from sin. Genesis chapter 3. There's harmony and beauty and rhythm in creation. Sin enters the world and fractures, breaks. Things are not the way it's supposed to be. In fact, Colossians 2 says the problem isn't just that it's broken. The problem is that it's dead. You and I were dead in our trespasses and sins. But here's the hope. Colossians 2 says God forgave our trespasses and sins by nailing them to the cross. See, that's the selfless sacrifice, isn't it? That is a perfect, holy, innocent man named Jesus from Bethlehem who called himself the bread of life and took on God's wrath, just wrath toward you and me. Penalty was death. He paid it in full as our sacrifice. He was the bread of life broken. And he lived a perfect life, and he died a death on our behalf. And see, if the story stops there, there's no reason to hope. He's just another dead man in Rome. A lot of dead men in Rome. But you see, 3 days later, what happened? His disciples show up, eager, because he said he would rise, and how is that possible? And there's a Roman guard there, and as they show up, they see an angel who says, "Why are you searching for what's dead when he's alive, just like he told you?" And so that's the sure hope. That's the sure hope that yes, he died, and yes, he lived a perfect life, died on our behalf, but he rose again. And that's why we get 1 Peter chapter 3, which says this. I love this. Because of God's great mercy, he has given us new birth, a new life, a fresh start, new future. That's what Naomi experiences when she walks back into Bethlehem. We'll see that more in the next 3 weeks, but here's what he says. God has given us new birth into a living hope. There's no dead hope around here. It's a living hope. How? Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. See, this is why we can't just leave this story in the Old Testament. No, this story is a story that you're a part of and I'm a part of, and that God has been writing since creation past, this narrative of redemption. And that's how we can have hope in our hurt. Two answers. Naomi gives us one. She says this. What we learn from Naomi is, how do we have hope in our hurt? Well, first, we remember the character of God. Remember the character of God. Remember what he's like, who he said he is. Let me show you this. Look back in verse 20. This is easy to miss. Verse 20, here's what Naomi says. She comes back into Bethlehem. She says this. Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, which means bitterness. For the Almighty, that's an important word. Circle it, underline it, highlight it. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has oppressed me, and there it is again, Almighty has afflicted me. Now here's what's cool about this word now, Almighty. It's the Hebrew word Shaddai. It's a title for God that points to his omnipresence, his omnipotence, and his total reign and rule over all creation. So she says, hey, remember the character of God. He's almighty, which means two things. He's always in control. He's always in control. There's not a single detail of the Naomi story or your story or my story that God hasn't written from before the foundation of the world. And man, it's so easy in the thick of hurt and pain and bitterness to forget that. And this story says you got to remember that. He's always in control. He's always intricately working for your good and his glory, even in seasons of pain and hurt and sorrow. So take heart that he's always in control. And second, he's always faithful. See this in verses 20 again. She says, why do you call me Naomi? Call me Mara. For the Almighty has made me very bitter. Verse 21. I went away full, but the Lord, circle that word, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi? Since the Lord has opposed me. So Almighty is a title for God that means, it points to his omnipotence, his complete rule and reign. Lord is the name Yahweh, which is soaked in his covenant faithfulness to his people. And when Naomi walks back into Bethlehem and fields that she thought would be barren forever, barley's popping up everywhere. I have to think that she remembered, man, he's always faithful. He's always faithful. When I put my husband in the ground, he's always faithful. When I bury my sons and with them grandchildren and great-grandchildren and future and secure. He's always faithful. Even when I don't understand it, even when I don't see it, even when I don't like it, he's always faithful. And he's always in control. Hope in our hurt, how is that even possible? One, we got to remember the character of God. But then you might say, okay, but I've got to be honest. When I'm in the middle of it, when I'm hurting, when the pain is deep, I don't know that I can trust that he's in control. How can I trust that he's faithful? Doesn't seem like it. It seems like the hand of the Lord is against me. And that's where I would say, okay, but remember, this is not just an Old Testament story. This is a story starting in Genesis that climaxes in the Gospels when the God of the universe steps into the earth that you and I are a part of, as broken as it is, lives, dies, and rises again. So yes, remember the character of God, but second, where do we get some hope in our hurt? Look at the empty tomb. See, if the tomb is still empty, then everything God said about himself and his promises, it's just silliness. It's just fiction, fairy tale. In fact, Paul says, if the tomb is not empty, then you're a fool to trust in him. You're a fool to hope in him. What reason would you have? But if the tomb is empty, church, and that's not Christian myth, that is historical reality. If the tomb is empty, then you have every reason to put your hope in him. Because it means that everything he said about himself, that he will never leave us or forsake us. He's our comforter and our strength, our rock and our refuge, our hope and our deliverer. It's all true. It's all true. Because he lives, what does the hymn say? I can face tomorrow. Even when it feels like every step is 1,000 pounds, I can face it. Because he lives what? All fear and anxiety and worry and stress, it's gone. Because I know that he holds the future, even when it means I have to bury my husband and my son and I have nothing. Life is worth living because he lives. Where do we get hope in our hurt? Remember that he's always in control. He's always faithful. And the tomb is empty. And one day he's coming back. And there won't be any stories like this. There won't be any hurt or pain or tears or sorrow. Until then, let's remember the character of our God, that he lives, he's in control, he's always faithful, and that the tomb is empty, his promises are true. Let me pray for us.